The camera rests on the rain-streaked glass of a Manhattan cafe. Claire Whitaker had come to sign divorce papers. Nothing more. By noon, her wrists would be bruised. Her husband would have threatened the one friend she still trusted, and a stranger's voice would be the only thing standing between her and whatever came next. For 3 years, Claire had survived a marriage to a man who smiled at charity galas, donated to museums, and broke her spirit behind closed doors. She thought she knew what danger looked like. She thought one final meeting in a public place would be enough. She was wrong. The man who intervened that gray Tuesday morning was no saint either. In some ways, he was more frightening than the husband she was trying to escape. But he was the first person in years who made her feel safe. Beside her lay a manila folder containing 12 pages of cold, bureaucratic surrender. Her lawyer had promised a clean exit. But Claire knew better. There is no clean way to cut apart 3 years of a shared life, especially when one person still believes the other belongs to him. She had chosen this corner on West 54th Street carefully, close to the counter, visible from the street, near the barista who knew her name. 18 months earlier, she had stopped calling that paranoia. That was the night Damon drove his fist through the drywall 6 inches from her face because dinner was 20 minutes late, then cried afterward and said she had made him feel invisible. At exactly 11:04, the brass bell above the door chimed. Damon Vale stepped inside, bringing the storm with him. Damon was handsome in a way that made people forgive him too quickly. Tall, with silver threaded through his dark hair. He wore a charcoal suit that spoke of old money and effortless control. His face had the kind of symmetry people trusted before they knew better. He could sound wounded in one breath and dangerous in the next. And for 3 years Claire had watched entire rooms choose the wounded version. His eye swept across the cafe, measuring exits, witnesses, and angles, before landing on her with practiced warmth. It was the warmth he used when he wanted something. He pulled out the chair opposite her without asking and sat down as if the table, the room, and Claire's remaining courage were all still his property. "You look tired," Damon murmured, his voice soft enough for anyone nearby to mistake it for concern. Claire did not flinch. She slid the folder across the wooden table and told him the terms were settled. He did not touch the papers. Instead, he reached for her untouched coffee, lifted the cup, turned it slightly in his hand, then set it down where he wanted it. A small movement. A familiar warning. He pleaded for a kinder conversation, reminding her of 3 years of marriage, and all the people who still believed they were a beautiful couple. Claire looked him in the eye and said she would rather they become strangers. For 1 second, his mask slipped. The civilized husband vanished, and something cold stared out from under the expensive suit. She had learned to read him like weather turning violent. The small stillness, the lowered voice, the way his smile stayed in place after his eyes went empty. Damon mentioned Marta, casually naming her address on 86th Street, 3rd floor, as if he were only asking after an old friend. Claire went rigid. It was a classic Damon threat, dressed up as polite concern about how dangerous the city could be for a woman without protection. He left no proof, but the blow landed exactly where he wanted it. Still, Claire refused to give him the pleasure of seeing fear. "Sign the papers." "Damon," she whispered. He leaned back and smiled wider as he began tearing apart the asset division. Damon claimed his lawyers had been too generous and said nothing was truly final without his signature. He threatened her work, naming restoration projects and clients like Calloway and Mercier with a soft promise of ruin. Around them, the ordinary music of the cafe continued. Steam hissed, porcelain clattered, and 2 women near the window laughed at something on a phone, unaware that a life was being cornered at the table behind them. When Claire said he had nothing on her, he smiled and mentioned his private investigator, the photographs, and Calloway's easily scandalized wife. Damon had always preferred clean hands. He did not need to strike when reputation, money and fear could do the work for him. Her hands turned ice-cold beneath the table, her heart beating hard enough to blur the noise around her. Her lawyer's advice to stay calm vanished the moment Damon leaned in and switched to fast. low Italian. The change frightened her. Her decade-old conversational Italian caught only fragments. Break lines. Marta's name. Then a phrase about making something slow enough to teach a lesson. The polished surface was gone. What sat across from her now was not a wounded husband or a wronged man. It was a man who had decided that if he could not own her, he would make freedom cost more than she could bear. Claire's mouth went dry. Legal papers suddenly felt paper-thin. The blood drained from Claire's face as the trap became clear. The meeting had never been about signatures. Damon had chosen a public place, so she would be forced to sit still, while he threatened her in ways no one else could prove. He knew how to hide cruelty inside tone, timing, and language. As he whispered in rapid Italian, her legs felt hollow, and she could not make herself move. Then a voice came from her left. It was not loud, but it carried enough weight to cut through the cafe noise. Claire turned and saw a stranger standing 4 feet away, half hidden until then by a concrete pillar. He looked as if he had been listening for longer than either of them knew. The man stood with a severe, almost architectural presence, a dark tileless figure against the dusty cafe window. His face was weathered and uneven, nothing like Damona's polished beauty, but it carried a gravity that made the air shift around him. His eyes stayed on Damon, not Claire, with the still patience of a predator. In quiet, measured English, he repeated Damon's threats back to him. The plan for Claire's breaks. The friend being watched on 86th Street. The promise of something slow and painful. His voice carried just far enough to freeze the nearest tables. The barista stopped moving. Damon's hand tightened around the edge of the folder. The espresso machine kept hissing behind them, and traffic rumbled beyond the glass. But their corner of the world had gone silent. Damon stared up at the stranger, the color draining from his face. Claire had seen his rage, his charm, his false remorse, and his careful cruelty. She had never seen him look small, now folded into his expensive coat. He looked almost ordinary. "I don't know who you are," Damon muttered, his usual warmth gone, his voice thin and cornered. "No," the stranger replied, utterly still. "You don't." Claire realized then how much of Damon's power depended on everyone agreeing not to look too closely. This stranger was looking. Damon gave Claire one last venomous look before scraping his chair back. He grabbed the manila folder, and her breath caught. If he took it, the nightmare would stretch on without even the illusion of progress. But he hesitated, dropped the papers back onto the table, and buttoned his jacket with trembling pride. Then he walked out, the brass bell above the door chiming with a thin, mocking sound. Alone again. Claire forced herself to breathe and loosened her grip on the table edge, where her white knuckles had left red marks. "He won tea, just let this go," the stranger said, keeping a careful distance. "No," she whispered, still watching the door. "He has already started." The stranger's voice stayed calm as he laid out the facts with surgical precision. Damona's threats were real. Marta's apartment was being watched. Claire's own movements had been tracked. She looked at him and felt the weight of his complete, unblinking attention. "How long were you there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. He told her professional threats were not his reason for stepping in, but once Damon moved toward physical harm, he could not ignore it. Claire stared at him as the adrenaline finally hit and her hands began to shake. She wanted to demand who he thought he was, stepping into her life and naming its dangers. But her voice would not obey her. He reached into his jacket and placed a heavy, embossed business card on the table. Adriano Moretti. No logo, just a name and a number. "If it escalates, call," he said. "Some problems are better handled by people who understand them." He left $300 bills on the table, abandoned his half-finished espresso, and slipped out through the side exit with the quiet certainty of a man who always knew where the exits were. Claire sat alone for a long time. Finally, she signed the divorce papers, hands still unsteady. When she looked at the card again, she hated how relieved she felt. Familiar hell suddenly seemed more dangerous than the unknown. Outside, the rain kept falling in hard sheets. That night, behind the heavy deadbolts of Marta's Upper West Side apartment. Claire told her everything. The meeting. The brake lines. The strange man who had stepped in. Adriano Moretti. Marta, practical as ever, did not hesitate. "Call the number," she said. "You didn't really know Damon either. And you still gave him years of your life." Claire slept badly, waking from dreams of Italian words she could not fully translate, and eyes that looked straight through her defenses. In the cold light of morning, she finally dialed the number. It rang twice. A deep voice answered with only one word. Moretti, when Claire identified herself. His brief silence said enough. "I know who you are," he replied. She asked what he had meant by helping her, but he said that conversation needed to happen face to face and gave her an address on East 67th Street. She arrived 15 minutes early so she could study the area and decide whether to leave before the door opened. Before her stood a massive 8-story limestone townhouse from the late 19th century, beautiful and badly neglected. Its elaborate carving spoke of a forgotten age of wealth and pride. Claire knew buildings. She knew how much truth lived in cracks, rot, and everything people tried to hide behind a grand facade. She studied the arched windows and weathered stone urns where wild ivy had been allowed to grow unchecked. Lights glowed somewhere upstairs, but the townhouse was clearly decaying, like a priceless object left too long in a locked room. At exactly 1:47, she rang the bell. A stern, silver-haired woman opened the door, her sharp eyes taking Claire in at once. "Ms. Whitaker," she said, then led her inside. The interior stopped Claire where she stood. As a restoration architect, she had spent her life finding beauty beneath neglect. But this house felt different. It did not merely need repair. It felt as if everyone who had lived in it had been trying not to remember it existed. Claire had walked through hundreds of damaged buildings and learned to read neglected stone like a language. But this place felt wounded in a deeper way. Weak sunlight cut through dusty windows, throwing sharp shadows over cracked geometric marble. Above her, plaster medallions clung to the ceiling like memories, and chandeliers hung shrouded in plastic. She noticed water damage above the west arch, a bowed section of railing, a fracture in the marble that someone had once filled badly and hoped no one would see. She was so absorbed in the quiet sadness of the hall that she did not notice the man watching from the library doorway. Adriano Moretti stood in shadow. "You early," he said. "I am always early," Claire replied, pulling her gaze away from the ceiling with visible effort. "Your building is extraordinary. It's also a disaster. Those two things can both be true." She glanced upward again, asking if the plaster was original, then mentioned the disastrous restoration from the 1960s. But she stopped herself. Her life was in danger. Why was she talking about plaster? Work had always been the place she ran when reality became too frightening. "Sorry," she whispered. "Force of habit." Adriano stepped back, his dark eyes calm and observant. "Don't apologize," he said. "Come in." The library smelled of sawdust, old paper, and smoke that had settled into the walls years ago. In the hard afternoon light from the high windows, Adriano Moretti looked different than he had in the dim cafe. The shadows revealed deep lines around his eyes, tension in his jaw, and a faint scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline. He looked like a man shaped by hardship, not comfort. Claire had learned not to trust comfort too easily. "Sit," he murmured, gesturing to the leather chairs near a fireplace dusted with fresh ash. He sat across from her, every movement quiet and deliberate. "I'll tell you what I know," he said, his voice lowering. "Your ex-husband has a private investigation firm on retainer. They have been tracking your movements for 3 months. I found out 6 weeks ago," Adriano said calmly. A familiar cold dread settled in Claire's stomach. He explained it with the ease of someone discussing a routine business overlap. But she could hear the dangerous world behind his silence. They knew her schedule, her office, her home on 86th Street, and whether she was seeing anyone. They had even photographed her leaving Marta S. building twice. The realization of how exposed she had been hit her like a blow. "He has no right to that," she whispered. "No," Adriano agreed. His eyes stayed on hers. But men like Vale rarely ask themselves what they have a right to do. "You're not doing this out of pure kindness," Claire said, her voice only slightly unsteady. Adriano studied her with a heavy, analytical gaze. "This building needs a restoration architect," he said. "I have rejected 11 firms. But yours has been on my list for a long time. I'm offering you a full contract. 8 stories. 18 rooms. Open timeline." Claire stared at him, her pulse quickening. "You just told me my ex-husband is tracking me. And your solution is for me to work here." "Yes," he said simply. "You don't think those things are related?" "They are related," he admitted. "But the contract is real. I do not use fake work as bait. I also think working from a secured base with private drivers would solve your immediate concerns," Adriano added smoothly. Claire sat in silence and let the meaning settle. 3 years of marriage to Damon Vale had stripped away any childish trust she once had. She knew Adriano belonged to a dangerous, organized world. But she also remembered Damon talking about cutting her brake lines. And she remembered the police, dismissing her fear 18 months earlier because there had been no visible injury. She looked at the powerful man before her and understood the trade he was offering. It was not simple. It was not clean. But fear had already taken so much from her that she could not pretend safety would arrive in a perfect form. Her voice cut through the dim, dusty library. "I would need to see the full scope of the building," Claire said, her fingers tightening around her leather bag. She wanted every floor, all original blueprints, every competing bid, and no hidden structural reports. Adriano stood still, a dark shape in the fading light, then accepted her terms with a slow nod when she asked for 24 hours to decide. He rose with her in a gesture that felt almost old-fashioned. At the heavy oak door, she paused. "What were you waiting for in that cafe?" she asked. "To decide whether to intervene," he admitted. The honesty should have unsettled her. Instead, it stayed with her all the way back to Marta's apartment. For the next 24 hours, Claire paced the worn floorboards of Marta's apartment. From the street below, anyone watching would have seen her eyes return again and again to the black utility vehicle, parked like a crouched animal near the curb. It felt like Damon's surveillance made visible. At noon, an unknown number sent her a photograph of her own front door. No message. No threat written out. Just the door. Running, she realized, would only stretch the chase. So she called Adriano and accepted the contract. After a heavy 2-second silence, he agreed. On Thursday, she arrived at the ruined townhouse, ready to bury herself in work because work, at least, had rules. Work was Claire's armor, a ritual she performed with care. For 6 hours, she moved through the bones of the grand townhouse, tracing only the damage that mattered first. Faded silk still clung to an upstairs room beneath amber light, and the hexagonal marble in the bath had survived against all reason. High above, on the rusted rooftop terrace, the city stretched out like a glittering, indifferent kingdom. On the top floor, stripped down to wooden studs, she found an Adriano. He stood in the orange light of sunset, a man alone inside his ruined inheritance. Even in deep decay, Claire could see the shape of something once loved and then abandoned for too long. Without his tailored jacket, his rolled sleeves revealed parallel scars along his forearm, matching the mark at his temple. He turned toward her, caught in the gold of the dying day. She told him the restoration would take 2 difficult years and cost a staggering amount. "Money is not an obstacle," he said quietly. "It should be," she replied. "Obstacles keep people honest." For the first time, something almost like amusement moved across his face. In that dusty, stripped room, the knot in Claire's chest loosened by 1 careful inch. "Then we have a deal," she said, but peace did not last. On the drive home, she checked the rearview mirror and saw the black utility vehicle following her. Her fingers shook as she dialed Adriano's number from memory and read the license plate aloud. His voice came back at once, cold and certain. "I see it." The realization chilled her. She was being watched not only by her stalker, but by her protector too. Adriano directed her to a concrete parking garage on 44th Street and told her to wait in the dark. For 7 long minutes. She sat with fear tightening around her ribs, while tires squealed somewhere below, and an elevator opened on an empty floor. Then a text appeared. "You are clear. The vehicle has been redirected." Claire stared at the word redirected until the screen dimmed. She did not ask what it meant, not yet. The word redirected followed her like a warning. Back in her apartment, she went through her nightly ritual. Deadbolt, chain, window locks. Dark panes checked twice. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she stared at her phone and heard Adriano's voice in her head. What kind of man could watch over her on an unannounced highway? And what kind of woman felt relieved by it? Before she could answer either question, another message arrived from an unknown number. No photo this time. Only 5 words. "You look safer than you are." Claire sat perfectly still. The room suddenly too quiet. Damon had not been redirected. He had simply chosen another road. 14 blocks away, on the bare top floor of his decaying mansion, Adriano stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought of Claire. She had asked for reports, bids, blueprints, and truth. Most people asked him for favors, money or mercy. Claire asked him for structural honesty. A cold shudder passed through him when he imagined what might have happened had he acted 20 minutes later in the cafe. His phone buzzed once. A message from Reyes. Veil moved again. New number. Same pattern. Adriano's face hardened. Something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. It was not convenient. It was not strategic. That made it dangerous. That night, sleep was a luxury neither of them had. For 4 days, Claire worked on her report, moving fast but carefully because the building kept pulling her in with small revelations. She found an 1890s butleress pantry sealed behind a false wall and a delicate cast-iron newel post on the narrow servant staircase. Every hidden hinge, every scar under old paint, gave her something concrete to understand. Her own life offered no such mercy. Damon's next move could come from anywhere. On the 4th afternoon, she noticed a delivery envelope left just inside the service entrance. No label, no sender. Inside was a single photograph of her standing on the rooftop terrace the day before. By the 2nd week, she understood that the house was a magnificent, difficult puzzle, the most compelling project of her career and a dangerous distraction from her own unraveling life. Adriano Moretti moved through the halls like a quiet shadow, sharing space without taking it over. He never hovered. He never questioned her measurements. When she asked something, he gave her a clean, unembellished answer. On the 4th day, they sat in the dim library, her laptop casting pale light across his face as she walked him through the numbers. He listened without interrupting, then asked 3 precise technical questions. Claire had forgotten how powerful it felt to be taken seriously, not soothed, corrected, or managed. The full restoration, she told him in the quiet library, would fall somewhere between $4.2 and $5.8 million. Once the walls were opened, it could climb even higher. Some clients, she explained, chose to leave service spaces alone. But Adriano looked at her with steady dark eyes and said the entire building would be restored, even the forgotten servant staircase. When she gave a small gasp, he admitted he had watched her spend 40 minutes admiring its ironwork that morning. Warmth rose unexpectedly in her face. She closed her laptop as he poured 2 glasses of water. The soft clink cut through the room. "The hidden places matter," he said. Claire heard more in the words than architecture. He had a quiet habit of handling small things himself, like sliding a cold glass of water toward her across the dark desk. Then, without warning, his voice broke the silence. "The car that followed you, Thursday, has been paid through the end of the month," he said. "After that, your husband will find the surveillance contract almost impossible to maintain." Claire froze as the meaning settled over her. He had interfered with Damon. He had stepped into her private nightmare without permission. She knew she should object, should defend her independence, should warn him about invisible debts. But another part of her remembered sitting alone in that garage, waiting to find out if anyone would come. That morning, she had rehearsed a fierce speech about independence in the mirror. But looking at him now, the words turned clumsy. Instead, she asked about Marta, whose building was being watched twice a day. If that changes, you will be told, he said. The glass of water felt too cold in her hand, so she set it down. I didn't agree to any of this, she whispered. He did not deny it. He only sat there, patient, without the defensive guilt she had learned to expect from men. When she asked why he had done it, his silence did not feel like the pause of a liar. It felt like a man deciding how much truth she could bear. Because I could, he said, and because he meant it. That isn't a complete answer, she said quietly. No, he agreed. It isn't, but she let the silence remain between them. 11 days later, she moved into the townhouse. Officially, it was practical. A way to save 90 minutes of commuting. But Claire knew the real reason. 3 nights earlier, Damon had stood beneath her third-floor Brooklyn window at 11 o'clock. He had not shouted or knocked. He had simply stood under the cold streetlights and looked up, one hand tucked into his coat, patient as a man outside a house he still owned. In a panic, she called Adriano's number. He answered on the first ring. Minutes later, Damon was gone. She arrived on a Tuesday with 2 suitcases and a box of books. Elena received her on the 4th floor with the tired, knowing look of someone who had seen too much tragedy to be surprised by it. The suite was beautiful, not in the loud way of new money, but with the quiet dignity of old linen and real books. From the window, Claire looked down at the overgrown garden. She unpacked in 40 minutes, a habit born from years of being ready to leave quickly. Standing alone in the center of the room, she understood that she was now living under the roof of a man she had known for less than 3 weeks. A man whose wealth had shadows. Then her phone lit up. Unknown number. 1 line, nice room. She pushed away the image of Damon beneath her window and buried herself in work. Soon a rhythm formed. She began at 7 each morning. Contractors arrived at 8. Her favorite hours were between 5 and 8 in the evening, after the workers left and the house belonged to old timber, settling brick, and the low murmur of Adriano's voice through the floorboards. Twice that week, Elena invited her to join him for dinner at 7. By the second invitation, Claire said yes, drawn by a comfort she had not felt at a dinner table in years. They ate by candlelight in the half-ruined dining room, careful with each other, while her phone stayed face down beside her plate. The scene was almost absurdly romantic, candlelight flickering against the bones of a broken house. They sat at one end of a table built for 14, surrounded by scaffolding and cracked walls. Adriano did not ask empty, polite questions. He listened with an intensity that made her chest ache, remembering every detail when she spoke about design and history, when she asked about the house. He told her about the shipping magnate who built it in 1887 and traced the family line with the care of someone guarding old ghosts. You care about it, she said, surprised. It belonged to my grandfather, he replied softly, and his father before him. His voice changed on the word grandfather. My family acquired this place in 1923, Adriano said as the candle flame trembled. Every Moretti neglected it, including me. Until recently. What changed? She asked. He met her eyes. I decided I had neglected things long enough. It was not only about brick and mortar. By the 3rd week, Damon's attorney sent a letter reopening the asset division. In the library, Claire read 12 paragraphs of legal poison, demanding a financial review that would delay the divorce by at least 6 months. The old nausea of being trapped returned. At the bottom of the final page, Damon had written one sentence by hand. You always did choose badly when frightened. The room seemed colder when Claire said it aloud. Her ex-husband was escalating because he sensed a weakness and wanted to tear at it. Adriano stayed perfectly still as she read the letter, a silent shape in the dim room. When he asked what her attorney thought, Claire's voice carried the weight of exhaustion. It was a classic delay tactic. Her lawyer had said, a slow burn designed to drain her until surrender felt easier than fighting. Damon wanted all 3 jointly owned properties, though he had once called them sentimental burdens in front of friends. It was not about the properties. It was about making sure every door Claire tried to open led back to him. Outside, a pale September rain began to fall. Adriano said there were other ways to handle it, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous promise that made her look up. Claire gripped the letter, needing something physical to hold on to. She admitted she understood what he was capable of, though she did not want the details. Then she begged him not to interfere. She needed to survive this on terms she could live with. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of anger after 3 weeks of watching from a distance. His voice stayed flat as he laid out the facts. Damon was not stopping. The letter was only the official attack. Privately, he had been calling her clients, describing her as unstable and claiming she had abandoned her marriage to run with a criminal syndicate. The air seemed to freeze around her. Adriano explained that Damon had been questioning her professional integrity, calling her compromised to the clients who mattered most. Claire's body reacted before her mind could. She stood just to find enough air. Damon knew exactly where to strike, because for years she had told him what mattered to her. Her work, her reputation. The one part of her life he had never fully owned. When she realized Adriano had been monitoring those communications since the day they met in the cafe, she turned toward the window. Rain beat hard against the old glass. She felt violated by his surveillance and, at the same time, painfully grateful. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Adriano only agreed, his eyes fixed on hers. He looked like a man braced for the cost of his own choices, but not sorry for making them. When she demanded to know what else he had hidden, 3 heavy seconds stretched between them. Then he gave her everything. The surveillance teams, the investigators hired to shadow her, the financial tracking he had run on Damon, and the fact that one of Damon's men had tried to get a building employee to copy her key. Claire listened in silence, taking in the scale of the invisible shield built around her life without asking her permission. Her face went still as she processed the truth. When he finished, she said he had been running a shadow operation to protect her. Adriano called it managing a situation. She turned away from him and stared at the rain-soaked garden, trying to sort through the tangled mess of fear, anger, and relief inside her. "I spent 3 years with a man who controlled me and called it protection," she whispered. That was the line she could not cross. Damon had always started with concern, too. He worried about her clients, her friends, her clothes, her tone. By the end, concern had become a locked door. Claire would not mistake a softer cage for safety. She told him she would never submit to that kind of control again. Behind her, Adriano shifted, his usually flat tone carrying rare force. He said this was different. He had withheld information to keep her safe from immediate threats, not to take away her power. But when she turned and asked whether he truly could not hear how close that sounded to Damon's excuses, silence fell again. His jaw tightened. Then with painful honesty, he said he could hear it. They stood apart in the dim room while the candles flickered in the cold draft. For the first time since she had met him, Adriano looked not dangerous or composed, but ashamed. She demanded to be part of every decision. She would not be handled. When Adriano quietly agreed, she knew he meant it. He was not a man who wasted words on comfort, reclaiming her own agency. Claire decided to call her client directly and confront Damon's lies head-on. She would sacrifice properties if she had to. She would take the financial damage, but she would not let him break her. Adriano told her, softly, that it was the right path. As she looked at him, the weight of what he had been carrying finally hit her. For weeks, he had been fighting a war in silence, and now she had forced him to open the map. "How many other battles are you fighting without saying anything?" she asked. The silence told her the answer. Several, when she asked how he survived a life split into so many hidden wars. He looked at her and said, "You find what is worth protecting. Then you protect it." Something quiet and dangerous stirred in her heart. She understood then that his devotion was no longer merely professional. It frightened her more than his name, his guards, or the whispers attached to him. Damon had called possession love. Adriano was offering protection. But Claire knew even protection could become a chain if no one watched the lock. Claire had known another kind of trust once. The desperate hope she had given Damon and mistaken for certainty. This felt different. Real trust was not a blind leap. It was a slow gathering of evidence, built by watching what someone did under pressure. From the window of her fourth-floor suite, she watched rain drown the garden in gray. Marcus Calloway's voice on the phone was direct and steady. He refused to believe Dam's synonymous poison and reminded her that character outlasts noise. After she hung up, Claire stared into the glass. If she was going to fight for her dignity, she could not do it halfway. She dialed her attorney. "File the response," she said. "Give them everything." 2 days after the filing, the storm arrived. Claire was on the 3rd floor, debating plaster specifications, when a sudden change in the building's sound made her freeze. The contractor beside her went silent. Down below, in the grand marble entrance hall, stood Damon. He had slipped through the tightest protocols like a ghost, smiling politely at Elena as if he were an invited guest. Beneath the dusty chandeliers and scaffolding, his eyes moved over Claire's work with open contempt. 4 feet from him stood Adriano Morti. Claire had seen Adriano tense, patient and precise. She had never seen him like this. Perfectly still, as if every violent thing in him had gone quiet at once. Adriano stood with his arms loose at his sides, his face emptied of warmth. It was no longer a polite mask, but something older and more dangerous. At the top of the dark stairs, Claire realized Damon had finally met a force he could not easily charm or shame. Damon's voice floated upward in that familiar negotiating tone, reasonable and rehearsed, the tone he used to dominate a room. He gestured at the dust as if he were the only adult present. He even laughed once, softly as if disappointed in everyone. Adriano did not move. As Damon's tone sharpened, his eyes flicked toward the staircase. Claire pressed herself into the shadows, gripping the cold wood. Then Adriano spoke. The words from below were quiet, but they cut through the air and stopped Damon mid-sentence. A thick silence filled the marble hall. Damon looked up and found Claire. What burned in his eyes was not rage or contempt, but a cold promise of future ruin. It was the same look he had worn after the charity gala, where he had convinced everyone she was tired, then bruised her wrist in the car for embarrassing him with silence. Damon turned back to Adriano, and whatever he saw there made him button his jacket with the same defensive motion Claire remembered from the cafe. Then he walked out and slammed the heavy front door behind him. The building seemed to exhale. Claire peeled her cold hands from the mahogany railing and forced herself down the stairs. Adriano stood motionless, staring at the closed door as his face slowly rebuilt itself into something human. "What did he say?" she demanded, using sharpness to hide her racing heart. Adriano tried to protect her from the answer, but she reminded him of their agreement. Honesty was the only way this could survive, he admitted. Damon had threatened retaliation and boasted that he was beyond anyone's control. When she asked what Adriano had said back, a cold, humorless smile flickered across his mouth. "I told him he was welcome to try," he murmured. Claire felt the floor under her feet seem to harden into something irreversible. That cold, deliberate gaze had promised a slow ruin. "He isn't going to stop," Claire whispered. She had said the same thing before, but now it landed like fact. "No," Adriano replied. Ian's tea. The hall smelled of rain and wet marble from the open door. Above them, the chandeliers hung like wrapped ghosts. "What happens next?" Claire asked. Adriano looked at her, his jaw tightening. In his eyes, she saw the weight of a history he had carried alone. Damon had not walked in only to scare her. He had walked in because he believed he had found leverage. "He found something," Adriano said quietly. "About my history. He is going to use it," Adriano said, and the air turned colder. "What did he find?" Claire asked. He was silent for a long moment. "Everything," he murmured, standing at the foot of the grand, damaged staircase. Claire understood that the next storm would be worse than anything she had survived so far. Still, she did not want to run. That night, Sleep was impossible. In her four-poster bed, she stared at the familiar plaster patterns on the ceiling, while one word circled through her mind. Everything. Adriano did not exaggerate. This was not fear spoken by a cornered man. It was fact. And Damon, for all his polish, had always been most dangerous when he had a file in his hand. Damon Vale had the money, patience and cruelty to dig up every secret Adriano Moretti had ever buried. He also had a gift for presenting malice as civic duty. Claire could already imagine him speaking to a reporter, voice soft, face grave, playing the concerned ex-husband who only wanted to expose a criminal influence around his unstable wife. Adriano had kept the worst of it to himself, looking at Claire with the exhaustion of a man lowering a burden he had carried for too long. Tomorrow, he had said. Let me make some calls tonight. Claire had agreed, not because she was ready for the truth, but because it was coming whether she was ready or not. At 6:45 the next morning, the library was heavy with exhaustion, sharp coffee, and scattered papers. Adriano sat at the mahogany desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled high. 3 dense stacks of documents lay in front of him. When he looked up, deep shadows marked the skin beneath his eyes. The night had produced answers, but not comfort. Sit, he said, quiet but firm. Claire sat. Elena entered with 2 cups of black coffee and left as silently as a woman who knew when a room needed privacy. Adriano looked at the dark liquid, then at Claire. My family, he began, has been involved in organized crime in New York since 1931. My great-grandfather started it. My grandfather expanded it. My father ran it until he died 12 years ago. Adriano said. I inherited it when I was 31. Claire gripped her cup and said nothing. She had known this truth in outline, but hearing it aloud gave it weight and edges. Adriano explained that his syndicate employed 40 people and hid its operations behind shipping, construction, and waste management. He watched her closely, searching for disgust, or perhaps for the moment she would leave. I have been investigated by federal authorities 4 times, but never charged, he added. My lawyers are brilliant, and witnesses do not cooperate. He did not soften the last sentence. Why didn't they cooperate? Claire asked, needing to hear the answer from him. Because people understand the cost of speaking, Adriano said without flinching. And because for 12 years, I have managed every piece of evidence. Claire set down her cup, porcelain clicking against wood. Managed, he leaned forward. I am not careless. I do not pull triggers, Claire, but I have given orders that did. Legally, that distinction keeps me free. Morally, it means nothing. His voice held no excuse. No performance of remorse either. Just the fact, placed between them like a blade. What did Damon find? She asked. Adriano pushed 1 stack of papers toward her. A federal investigation closed 18 months ago. The case involved bid rigging, payoffs, and 2 acts of arson meant to crush competition. Adriano said. The buildings were empty. No one died. But the investigation ended only when my witness vanished. Claire looked at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. And Damon has this. Adriano nodded. The entire federal file. If it reaches the authorities or my rivals, my world collapses. He wants to blackmail me. Claire's breath caught as the pieces locked together. He wants you to stop protecting me. Adriano's jaw tightened. He wants more. He is offering a trade. He drops the divorce litigation and ends surveillance. In exchange, the file stays locked in his safe. And I disappear from your life completely. Adriano said. My lawyers declare there is no relationship between us. The room seemed to shrink around Claire. He wants you to announce that I am no longer under your protection. The word protection hung between them like glass. It would leave you exposed. Adriano said quietly. No surveillance, but no shield against whatever comes next. Claire went cold. Like the brake lines, she said. She stood abruptly and paced to the window, where damp October roses faded in the gray morning. Damon's offer was not peace. It was a staged retreat, the kind he used before striking harder. He wanted her isolated again. That was the point. He'll destroy you, she said, her breath fogging the glass. If you refuse, he sends that file to the feds. Adriano stood close behind her. And if I accept? You are left alone with a man who has already shown what he is willing to do. Claire turned. That is a real choice. No, he agreed. It is in his dark eyes. She saw no fear for himself, only a desperate need to keep her safe. The realization hit hard. You're not afraid of the file, she said. You could survive it. You have 12 years of resources. Lawyers, power. His silence confirmed it. Damon had not found Adriano's weakest point. He had found Claire. The file is a problem, she said slowly. Sitting again. But it isn't fatal. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, thinking like an architect facing a structural collapse. The truth became clear. Adriano was not terrified of what Damon could do to him. He was terrified of what Damon would do to her if they accepted the deal. His quiet yes filled the room like lead. She thought of his 12 years of clean operations, his 40 employees, and the man who had casually discussed cutting her brake lines over coffee. If she wanted a way out, she had to understand the foundation of Adriano's past. Tell me about the fire, she said. Adriano hesitated. His face tightened. He paused, and it was as if ash hung in the air between his words. A rivalous warehouse had burned. The official ruling was arson, and the threads led back to him. The competitor withdrew, and the contract went to Adriano's side. Claire kept her face still. Was anyone inside? She asked. No, he said. I made sure of it. She weighed that answer. Legally, the distinction mattered. Morally, the order still stained the soul. Adriana's hands were dirty. He did not pretend otherwise. But Damon Vale, who had smiled while planning to cut her brake lines, carried a different kind of rot. The kind that needed innocence nearby so it could feel powerful. What does Damon want from me? She asked. The heavy library drapes cast shadows across Claire's face, catching the faint tremor in her fingers. Damon wanted a clean escape. No record of his cruelty. No financial scars. Everything severed on his terms. But then what? Across the desk, Adriano's jaw tightened, his silence carrying the weight of the answer. He wanted to stop. She whispered. Even if she surrendered everything, he would not let her go. No, Adriano said, his voice low. I do not believe he will. Damon had spent months dragging them into this, hiring shadows and standing beneath windows. This was never love twisted by grief. This was possession, wounded pride, and punishment wearing the face of heartbreak. It was the truth her lawyer avoided, and her therapist had tried to name before Claire stopped going. This was never about real estate or money. It was about making sure that wherever she ran, Damon had already poisoned the ground beneath her feet. She had been surviving day by day. But sitting in Adriano Moretti's library under the cold October light, she understood that survival was no longer enough. Then her phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. At 7:14 in the morning, Rachel Brenner's name flashed on the screen. Rachel's voice was too controlled, the flat tone of a professional delivering bad news. Claire, she said, there's a piece going live in an hour. It's about Adriano Moretti and his business. The article would describe Claire's living situation and her professional ties to Adriano in the silent library. Claire felt ice move through her chest. What outlet? She asked. When Rachel named it, the room seemed to lose all air. It was not a cheap gossip site. It was a respected financial journal, the kind New York's wealthy read over investor dinners. Claire knew who had fed them the story before she asked. The source was anonymous, but the details were too precise, taken from private investigative records. Rachel paused. Claire, your name is in it. It calls you a contractor living with a known mob figure. It questions your judgment and suggests your clients review their ties with you. Claire whispered, how bad is it? Bad enough that I am calling you at 7 in the morning, Rachel said. The silence between them was heavy. Claire ended the call and placed the phone on the desk with careful precision, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Adriano's face had turned to stone. He moved faster than I expected. Claire murmured. He sent the files last night. A shadow passed behind Adriano's eyes. while they had been standing in the entrance hall arguing with Damon. The fuse had already been lit. Damon had not come to negotiate. He had come to watch the first spark and savor the moment he outmaneuvered them both. He played you, Claire whispered. Adriana was cold and absolute. Yes, he did. The Callaway contract, the largest project of Claire's career, was now under immediate review. Her other active clients would read the article and make their own calculations. For 15 years, she had built her reputation piece by piece. Even during her marriage, while Damon chipped away at her confidence, she had rebuilt herself project by project. Now, in less than an hour, he was going to swing a hammer at that foundation. Can it be stopped? She asked. No, Adriano said. It's already formatted. I have a call out to someone with influence. But the timeline is bad. His phone vibrated twice on the desk. Then Claire's phone buzzed too. Another unknown number. This time, a single line. Everyone reads the morning news. And the calls he made to my clients before today? She asked. Those are already in motion, Adriano said. I monitored them. But I did not intervene, as you requested. The words hung in the cold room. Claire had demanded independence, and Damon had used the gap like a blade. She stood and walked to the window, staring at the dead garden outside. She forced herself to look at the damage without softening it. Then her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Callaway. Heard something is coming out. Call me before 8. Marcus was 62 and had built his empire over 30 years. He was formal, careful, and not easily embarrassed. That made his message worse. He answered on the second ring. Claire, he said, his voice careful and direct. I'm going to ask you a question, and I expect a direct answer. Are you currently living with Adriano Moretti? After exactly 1 second, Claire found her voice. I am working from the building I was contracted to restore, she said. I have temporary residency there for the duration of the project. Yes, and is Moretti connected to organized crime? Claire looked across the room at Adriano, whose face revealed nothing. He is a complex figure with complex interests, she replied. This project is a legitimate restoration contract. Marcus Callaway sighed. That is not the clean answer my board will want. I need you to tell me this is not what it looks like, Marcus said. Claire thought of everything she could say. The legitimate work. Her 15 years of professional integrity. The designs. The hours. The truth. But Damon had built the trap too well. The calls. The article. The timing. The framing. Any defense might sound like an excuse to Marcus S. board. Marcus, she said, her voice steady. I need 24 hours. A long silence followed. The piece will be out in under an hour, he said. I know, she replied. I'm asking for 24 hours before you make any decision. I will have an answer to everything by then. Another silence stretched, the silence of a cautious man calculating risk. 24 hours. Once this fuse burned down, she would not get more. Claire set the phone down and turned to Adriano. I need the full truth, she said. No softened versions to protect my conscience. I need to know your exposure, your legal position, and exactly what Damon has to survive this. She had to look straight into the damage instead of guessing around it. Something shifted behind Adriano's dark eyes, a brief glimpse of the vulnerability beneath his armor. That will be a long conversation, he said. Then we should start, she replied. 40 minutes into the shadows of his empire, Elena's urgent knock shattered the quiet. Her eyes were tight with a fear Claire had never seen there before. There's a man at the door, Elena said. He has a badge, a federal warrant. The library turned to ice. Claire watched Adriano's face close completely, stripping away the quiet client she had come to know. He rose in one smooth, controlled motion. And for the first time she saw the full weight of the man who had built an empire from ash and dust. He calmly told Elena to show the agent into the front room and say he would be there in 2 minutes. This is Damon's work, he said, picking up his jacket. The timing makes it certain. Claire glanced at the stacks of documents, at her laptop, at the old house around them. Every secret suddenly seemed to have a pulse. The air in the library felt too heavy to breathe. I need you to go upstairs, Adriano said, his voice low and rough. Claire held her ground. Josette, she would not hide like a ghost. I am not going, she said, though dread pressed cold against her chest. If federal agents were downstairs, she would not cower from it. In Adriano's eyes, something flickered. Not anger, but calculation. The look of a man measuring the cost of her pride. Then stay here, he said quietly, more plea than command. Locked inside, she listened to the muffled, clinical voices in the hallway. Damon had not merely leaked the truth. He had handed it to the state and timed it for maximum damage. The article had been the warning flare. The warrant was the machine of ruin. Damon had never wanted to negotiate. He wanted destruction. Claire pictured him buttoning his jacket in the hall, a gesture she had mistaken for defeat. In truth, he had been watching the timer run down, for 11 minutes. Muffled voices droned beyond the door, each one a slow step toward the edge. Somewhere in the house, a contractor's drill stopped mid-burrow. Even the building seemed to listen. When the front door finally clicked shut, Adriano returned. He stood in the doorway, his face controlled to the point of terror, every emotion buried out of sight. They want 3 years of financial records, Adriano said flatly. I have 48 hours. Claire felt the room tilt. Is this survivable? She whispered. He looked at her, his eyes heavy. Legally, yes. Professionally, everything changes. He paused. Personally, that depends on decisions that are no longer mine to make. In that moment, Claire understood that she was no longer only restoring a building. She was standing inside the collapse of 2 lives, hers and his, with Damon somewhere outside pressing on the cracks. Her phone buzzed again before she could answer. Unknown number. No message. Only a photograph. Marta's apartment on 86th Street. Taken 40 minutes earlier. The lit window in the photograph was a silent threat. I know where she is. And your protectors are busy. Claire stared at the screen as her blood went cold. He isn't done, she whispered, looking up at Adriano. The warrant was a distraction to pull your eyes away. The illusion of professional distance was gone. Over 6 weeks, Claire had stopped seeing the townhouse as a work site and begun seeing it as a place she had chosen. But Damon had chosen Marta because he understood something cruel and simple. Fear for herself had limits. Fear for someone she loved did not. Claire held up the phone. Marta, she said. Adriano's icy control cracked open. Raw fury flashed across his face as he reached for his phone. Claire was already moving. She finally understood that waiting for someone to save her was not the same as being safe. Marta was her oldest friend. Innocent of this world of warrants and empires, and Claire was done being careful. She ignored Adriano calling her name, his voice sharp with surprise at being disobeyed. She ran into the hall and grabbed her coat, her mind racing through the terrible math of 40 minutes. Marta always left for work early. Damon knew patterns. He had always known patterns. That was how he controlled people. First their habits, then their fear, then their choices. Adriano intercepted her at the front door, with a speed that startled her. He did not touch her. He simply became a wall. You cannot go out there alone, he said, breathing hard. Then come with me, she demanded. He told her his guards were tied up with the warrant. I need 60 seconds to redirect them, he said, his control straining. Claire looked at the timestamp. 30. Adriano was already giving orders in Italian, his voice low, fast and absolute. It carried the authority of a man who had run an empire for 12 years and never needed to repeat himself. Claire watched him work and understood the bargain before them. She could hate the darkness and still need what it knew how to do. The car is coming around, we go together, Adriano said, leaving no room for debate. Claire did not fight him, because deep down she did not want to. They slipped into a waiting dark sedan driven by a silent, broad-shouldered man from Adriano's inner circle. The doors slammed, and the car tore into morning traffic. Claire stared at her phone, heart hammering as she counted the minutes. Marta always left for work at 8:15. She was a physical therapist, always early, always predictable. It was 7:52. 23 minutes left. The math tightened around Claire's chest. The sedan cut hard around a delivery truck, and Adriano braced one hand near her shoulder without touching her. 3 years of marriage had taught Claire to hide panic, because Damon had always used it against her. But as the sedan cut through wet streets, terror gripped her. Shallow breath, icy hands, the absolute certainty that something was wrong. She asked what Damon wanted with Marta, though her heart already knew the answer. Adriano said it was a demonstration of reach, a crude show of power after 48 hours of failure, as they ran a red light on 65th. Claire gripped the door and asked about the man who had taken the photo. Was he only watching, or waiting for Marta to step outside? Adriano did not answer quickly enough. That delay told her more than any sentence. Was there one man waiting in the shadows? Adriano's face glowed pale in the light of his screen as he said an army was unnecessary. This was a message, not an extraction. It required only one visible act of malice, enough to make Claire understand that Damon's reach was faster than her response. The sedan lunged north on Columbus, every hard lane change vibrating through her spine. She pictured Marta's third-floor walk-up, the unreliable intercom, the exposed fire escape, the old lock Marta had been meaning to replace. She pictured her friend stepping onto the sidewalk with coffee in one hand and keys in the other, brave and unaware. Claire stared at the wet asphalt and said, with grief thick in her voice, that she should have told Marta more. Adriano said she had only wanted to spare her from a terror she could not use. But Claire heard the dangerous echo. Damon had managed information too. Adriano shook his head slightly and said Damon had wanted captivity, while Claire had wanted protection. Before she could answer, the car reached 86th Street at 7:58. Her phone vibrated with a sudden, sickening buzz. She expected another photograph. Instead, it was Rachel Brenner calling. Claire knew then that storms rarely arrived one at a time. She answered, but her eyes were already searching the street. The media storm had broken. Rachel's voice was urgent. The story had gone live 2 minutes earlier, and reporters were already circling. Claire cut her off coldly as the car stopped half a block from Marta's building at 8:01. She shoved the phone away and stepped into the biting air with Adriano. Her eyes, trained by years of survival, swept the street for anything wrong. There, across the asphalt, half hidden by the skeletal wooden scaffolding of a half-renovated brownstone, she saw him, a silent figure waiting in shadow, not nervous, not lost, waiting. His phone was raised toward Marta's entrance, and his other hand rested inside his coat. The man stood like part of the scaffolding itself, dressed in dark clothes, not merely waiting but occupying the space with cold professional patience. His eyes stayed fixed on Marta's entrance. Claire pointed him out, her voice barely above a whisper. Adriano did not hesitate. Without running, he and his driver crossed 86th Street with the quiet, terrifying purpose of men who knew this kind of violence well. The watcher noticed them too late. Claire saw his shoulders shift as if he might reach for something. Then Adriano was in front of him, calm and close, while the driver blocked the street side. Claire stood frozen for 4 seconds. Then she turned toward Marta's entrance, already remembering the door code. Claire punched the old code into the keypad and slipped inside before the heavy door could close. She climbed to the 3rd floor quickly, hiding the panic that threatened to overtake her. Beneath her boots, the worn burgundy carpet and faded brass tacks felt painfully familiar, remnants of easier years. When she knocked, Marta opened the door in 12 seconds, fully dressed and ready for the day, confirming Claire's worst fear, compact, sharp-eyed, and direct. Marta took one look at Claire's pale face and stepped back. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice dropping. Claire heard movement outside the building below. A sharp male shout cut off too quickly. Claire shut the door firmly and told Marta to cancel her morning plans. Marta studied her with the keen eyes of a longtime friend, then made the call without another question. At the 3rd floor window, Claire watched the quiet drama unfold below. Adriano and his driver had trapped the watcher against the scaffolding, their bodies positioned with precise, inescapable calm. In a brief exchange no one else noticed. The man's phone passed into Adriano's hand. The watcher tried to smile once. Adriano leaned closer and said something that erased it. 4 tense minutes later, the man walked away with a defeated gait and did not look back. Claire realized she had been holding her breath the entire time. Adriano stood on the pavement and looked up along the gray facade toward the third-floor window. Behind dusty glass, Claire was only a silhouette in the pale October light. She lifted one hand, knowing the glare probably made her invisible. Below, he raised the confiscated phone in silent confirmation, then moved toward the entrance. Behind her, Marta's voice broke the moment. Demanding the truth now that her schedule was cleared, Claire turned to her friend, who sat tense on the couch, with the posture people take when fear for someone they love hardens into resolve. Claire told her everything: the cafe, the contract, the surveillance, the article, the warrant, and the photograph of Marta's window. When Adriano entered, the room seemed to cool. He stood near the door with the confiscated phone in his hand, while his driver guarded the hallway. When Claire finished, silence settled over the apartment. Marta stared at Adriano, and he met her judgment without blinking. "You read the organized crime specialist," Marta said. "Yes," he replied. "And you've protected her for 2 months." "Yes," Marta turned to Claire. "And you in love with him?" Heat rushed into Claire's face. An undeniable answer to a truth she had avoided naming through sleepless nights on the 4th floor. Her silence was enough. Marta looked back at Adriano. "What happens if I am a target?" "You were leverage," he said. "That leverage has been handled." Adriano set the phone on the counter. "The photos are gone," he said, "and the photographer has been encouraged to find other work." "Strongly encouraged," he added. Marta picked up the dark device. "What does strongly encouraged mean in your world?" "It means he will wake tomorrow with a clear understanding that this work is not worth his life," Adriano said. "He won to be back." Marta set the phone down and gave Claire the look she had been using for 15 years. "You moved into his house," she said. Claire tried to deflect, insisting she was only working on the building. But Marta repeated it with certainty. "Does he know you love him?" Once again, the room went silent. Outside, a city bus rumbled past and a dog barked. Ordinary sounds from a morning that had no idea how close tragedy had come 20 minutes earlier. "We need to talk about what happens next," Claire said. "Damon isn't finished. The article is live. The warrant is moving. And I have 22 hours left on my promise to Marcus Calloway. I need a real plan." As she spoke, something in Adriano's expression shifted into cold operational focus. The place where he was most comfortable. "Marta cannot stay here for the next 48 hours, he said firmly. "That is not negotiable." Marta began to object, but his sharp gaze stopped her. "He used you to get to her," he said. "He will do it again if he can." Marta yielded because she understood the danger, though she swore under her breath while packing. Within an hour, she was on her way to a midtown address Adriano had arranged. Claire stood on the sidewalk and watched the car turn the corner into the autumn cold. A heavy quiet settled over her, the strange calm that follows when a crisis becomes merely difficult instead of immediate. Adriano stood beside her, silent and present, asking nothing. "The plan?" she asked. "Walk," he said. "I think better walking." They headed east on 86th Street into the morning rush, passing flower stands, delivery bikes, and strangers who had no idea how close one woman's life had come to breaking apart. "Damon has fired every weapon he has," Adriano said. "The investigation, the article, the pressure on your clients. He expected me to freeze and your career to collapse. He did not account for you." Claire looked down. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted. "The article is live, and Calloway has 21 hours. If he holds, the others may hold. If he breaks, everything falls." She thought of the house on 67th Street, the marble floors, the mahogany staircase, the pale silk wall coverings. She thought of the passion she had poured into those rooms, and the way Damon could turn even honest work into suspicion if given enough time and the right audience. She thought about what she was willing to risk in the next 24 hours. "I need to speak to Marcus Calloway myself. In person, she said. I need to tell him the truth about who you are, what that building is, and why I am there. Adriano stopped near a flower stand, where a vendor arranged bright sunflowers with practiced hands. That truth may cost you the contract, he warned. I know, Claire said, holding his gaze. But the alternative is building the next 3 years of my life on a lie. I already wasted 3 years building a marriage on illusions. I want to do it again. Her voice did not shake. What Calloway does with the truth is his decision, Claire said. Adriano watched her with the quiet attention she had once found unnerving, and now felt as safe as a harbor. All right, he said. I need you to let me do this without managing the outcome, she added. Whatever he decides, let it be. All right, Adriano repeated, beneath his usual control. His voice sounded raw. I know I have made it difficult for you to trust me, he said, but when I agree to something, I keep my word. Full stop. Standing beside the flower stand, Claire thought of the promises Damon had used as weapons. Adriano's promises felt heavier, not prettier. That was why she believed them. She thought about the careful way she had learned to measure reality, comparing the darkness of her marriage with everything she had seen in Adriano over the last 6 weeks. I know, she said, surprised by how deeply she meant it. They called Marcus Calloway from the car and arranged a noon meeting, back at the townhouse. Adriano locked himself in the library with his attorney, while Claire went up to the 4th-floor bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was tired, thinned by 2 months of adrenaline and sleepless nights. But for the first time in years, she no longer looked like someone apologizing for taking up space. She dressed to be taken seriously. She smoothed the dark fabric of her trousers and adjusted the sharp, well-tailored jacket she had bought with her own hard-earned money long before her marriage. It was armor, but not vanity. Presentation was communication. Adriano stood in the dim library doorway, his gaze tracing her with the quiet focus of a man watching a final scene assemble itself. You don't need anything else, he murmured. Claire walked the last 2 blocks alone, feeling the pavement under her feet and reminding herself that some battles had to be entered under her own power. On the 14th floor, she studied the lines of the ceiling to steady herself until Marcus Calloway emerged and led her into his sunlit office. They sat across from each other with the stakes unspoken between them. Tell me, Marcus said. For 31 minutes, Claire laid out the anatomy of her life. She spoke of the cafe, the contract, and the history of the building. She did not hide the divorce, Damon's poison in the press, or the federal shadow over Adriano. She drew a clear line between her honest work and her client's darker business. Her voice softened only when she spoke of the cast-iron staircase and the ghost-pale silk wall coverings. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Will this lead to federal charges? He asked. I don't know, she said, because a careful truth was better than a comforting lie. If he is charged, the project enters legal limbo, Marcus said, his voice low. Claire nodded, accepting the risk. But your designs exist independently of ownership, he added. Another silence stretched between them. He brought up the article and the accusation that her personal life had compromised her professional judgment. Claire's eyes stayed steady. My judgment, she said softly, is documented in every beam, joint, and material choice I have placed over the last 6 weeks. Let your engineers examine it. Let them challenge me on the work. In the end, her work had to stand where gossip could not. Marcus sighed and said his board would pressure him to suspend her contract. I know, Claire said, her voice calm. What do you want me to tell them? He asked. Tell them you hired me for my work, and my work has not changed. Tell them you looked me in the eye and got honest answers. Don't protect me. Marcus, just make an informed decision. She would not beg for respect she had already earned. Marcus looked at her, then pressed his palms flat against the dark mahogany desk. Give me 1 week, he said. Let the dust settle. I want to terminate this on whispers. She held his gaze, and a silent thank you passed between them. Donna, thank me yet, he warned. Just bring me the most beautiful restoration this city has seen in 20 years. At 1:43, Claire sat back in the quiet of the sedan and let exhaustion move through her. Relief ached in her chest, but beneath it, a deep clarity had taken root. Marcus had not saved her. He had given her room to prove she was still herself. She called Adriano. "Calloway is holding," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper against the glass. Silence stretched across the line. "He needs 1 week," she added. The line crackled before Adriano's low voice returned. "I am working on it." Then he stopped. Claire heard another voice on his end, sharp and distant. Adriano came back quieter. "Come straight home." He said something changed. Once the truth had been admitted, it could no longer be ignored. The car pulled up to the townhouse, and Claire stepped into the crisp afternoon. She looked up at the limestone facade, its damaged cornices and arched windows, still standing after 130 years of storms. Inside, Adriano waited in the silent entrance hall, completely still. She stopped 2 feet from him, beneath the plastic-wrapped chandeliers. "I know what you are going to say," he said quietly. "I have known for some time. I have been waiting for you to be ready." Claire looked at his worn face, the scar at his temple, and the devotion he had tried to disguise as strategy. In his stillness was the promise of a man who had decided she was worth protecting and had never wavered. "Adriano," she began, her voice trembling, but the heavy oak door burst open. Not Damon. One of Adriano's guards stood there, chest heaving from a hard run, his eyes bright with controlled panic. "Yes, here," the guard said. "Not alone. Service entrance. 3 men. 1 armed." The warmth drained from the room. From somewhere deep in the house came a faint metallic scrape. Then the smell of something sharp and chemical under the dust. Adriano's face froze into an impenetrable mask, in one smooth motion. His hand went inside his tailored jacket. In that brief second, the romantic haze of quiet dinners and silk-walled rooms shattered. What remained was the cold truth of Adriano's life. Dangerous, hidden and absolute. Claire wanted to run, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. The house around her was full of exposed wiring. Old timber, open walls, paint thinner, and stacks of drawings. One spark could erase months of work and trap anyone still inside. "Go upstairs," Adriano ordered, his face unreadable. "No," she said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "Tell me what is happening." He stared at her as the silence pulled tight between them. "Damon is here to finish this," he said softly, "and he brought someone who knows how." Claire's confession would have to wait. Adriano stood in front of her with one hand inside his jacket, his silhouette sharp against the dim foyer light, while 3 shadows moved near the service door. Somewhere above them, Elena called out from the second-floor landing, unaware of how quickly danger had entered the house. Everything they had built now depended on the next few minutes. "Then let's end it," Claire whispered. Outside, the narrow alley off 67th Street lay cold and forgotten. A tight stone passage she had mapped weeks earlier as part of the restoration, never imagining she was also charting a route through violence. The old house creaked around them, full of hiding places and dry wood. Claire knew the layout. The narrow service corridor, the 7-foot ceiling, the cold stone floor, and the single unlit bulb that had been on Elena's maintenance list for 2 weeks. Adriano's trusted man spoke rapid, tense Italian into his phone. One word made Adriano's jaw tighten. When Claire asked what it meant, his gaze locked on hers, and the truth landed hard. Damon had hired someone familiar with blades and accelerants. He wanted it to look like a structural accident, not murder. A bad wire, a careless contractor, a tragic old building under renovation. Damon would mourn in public and call himself devastated. Claire could see it too clearly. The deep, icy dread settled in Claire's chest. "Fire, he's going to burn it," she said. Adriano's face remained flat. Claire pictured the delicate silk wall coverings upstairs, the Carrara marble, the cast-iron posts that had survived 130 years. Then she remembered Elena on the second floor, Elena, she said. Adriano barked an order, and Reyes ran toward the stairs with his phone to his ear. Claire glanced toward the library, where 6 weeks of drawings and 15 years of hard-won reputation lay vulnerable. One portfolio case sat open on the table. Her entire design plan was inside. She turned away from it. Paper could be replaced. People could not. She hesitated for only 2 seconds before letting go of the thought. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Adriano moved toward the door with compressed efficiency. "Stay in the entrance hall. I'm engaging the bolt from outside." She stared at him. "You relocking me in. I'm locking them out," he said, and his face softened for half a breath. The police would arrive in 4 minutes. But he was going to the service entrance now. 4 minutes in an old house full of dust. Timber and fuel might as well have been an hour. Claire wanted to argue. But then a glass bottle shattered somewhere at the back of the building. The chemical smell sharpened. "Don't get hurt," she said. Something unreadable crossed his face before he disappeared through the door and turned the heavy century-old lock. Trapped inside the silent hall, Claire fought the urge to move. For 3 years. Work had been her way of outrunning pain. Now 4 minutes felt endless. At 90 seconds, she heard them at the back of the building. Not voices, but stealthy sounds made by people trying not to be heard. A foot scraped stone. A low curse. Then Elena appeared on the stairs behind Reyes, pale but safe. Claire pointed her toward the front parlor and kept listening, every nerve stretched thin. The cold stone floor carried the muffled sounds of a brutal struggle. A low voice muttered in a language Claire did not know. Then came silence, heavy and suffocating. After that, the terrible sound of flesh hitting stone. Not a graceful fight, not a scene from a film, but a raw collision of bodies in a cramped corridor. Something metal skidded across the floor. Reyes shouted once. Then nothing. Claire stood frozen. Fingers pressed hard against the locked door. Footsteps sounded on the other side. Slow and deliberate. The door opened, and Adriano stepped into the hall. His jacket was gone, and blood trickled steadily from a cut on his cheek. A dark stain spread over Adriano's ribs, promising a deep bruise by morning. His chest rose and fell hard, his breath broken by the effort of those 4 violent minutes. Behind him, Claire glimpsed the service corridor. Spilled liquid, a crushed lighter, and one broken bottle glinting near the threshold. The house had come within seconds of burning. "Are you hurt?" she asked, steady because she had to be. He winced and stepped closer, favoring his right side. "Ribs aren't broken. Reyes has 2 of them. The third, the one with the accelerant, ran, he will be found." He stopped 6 feet away, and his composure finally cracked. "Elena," he asked first. "She is safe," Claire said. Only then did something in Adriano's face loosen. She crossed the 6 feet between them and placed her palm against the sharp line of his jaw, carefully avoiding the cut. Beneath her hand, he went completely still, just as he had in the cafe before making a decision he could not take back. When he tried to speak, she shook her head softly. Don managed this moment. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, his jaw tight. When he opened them, the mask was gone. Around them, the entrance hall stood silent. Wrapped chandeliers, cracked marble, a staircase only partly restored, and the faint smell of fuel that could have taken everything. The magnificent, ruined building seemed to hold its breath. "I love you," she said, speaking words she had not used in 4 years. Back then, those words had been hope pretending to be certainty. This was different. It was not a fantasy of who someone might become. It was the truth of what she had seen, feared, questioned, and still chosen. Adriano looked at her, his rough hand covering hers against his jaw. Quietly, he admitted he had known for a long time, and that his love had begun the day she spent 40 minutes lost on the servant staircase. A breathless sound escaped her. 2 months of held emotion finally finding a way out. He pulled her close, careful of his injured ribs, and she leaned against the shoulder of the most dangerous man she had ever known. In that ruined hall, She thought of scars and fragile things that somehow survived. Outside, sirens wailed. 40 seconds away. They stepped apart, creating the distance the coming questions would require. It's going to be complicated, she said, thinking of the investigation, Damon the article, and the smell of fuel still clinging to the corridor. We have time, he murmured, touching her hand. Soon officers filled the hall. A detective arrived 8 minutes later. Adriano's attorney arrived exactly 17 minutes after that, with timing that surprised no one. In the grand hall, Claire answered the police with the same precision she brought to every difficult truth. Across the room, Adriano spoke with measured calm, giving exactly what was required after 12 years of surviving this dangerous game. The detective studied him with quiet respect, as if one professional recognized another. Downstairs, Reyes held 2 men whose futures had just collapsed, while the third was caught 3 blocks away with arson equipment. A stroke of luck Claire knew had been arranged. In chaos, facts were the only anchor. When asked about her relationship to the building and to Mr. Moratti, Claire answered plainly. The detective wrote it down, gave her a long, unreadable look, then moved to the next question. At 11:14 that night, Damon Vale was arrested at his Park Avenue apartment. Rachel Brenner called with the controlled excitement of a lawyer who knows the case is turned. Conspiracy to commit arson. Conspiracy to commit assault. The third man had cooperated, choosing the only exit left to him. Damon had reportedly asked whether the arrest could be handled discreetly, as if discretion were still owed to him. Your divorce is going to look very different now, Rachel said. Claire sat on the edge of her bed and looked up at the restored plaster ceiling she had finished 2 weeks earlier. The old damage was gone, and the elegant pattern had returned. For the first time in 2 months, the tension inside her began to loosen. Handle all of it, Claire told Rachel, placing the matter in her lawyer's hands. She sat in silence until midnight, when Elena entered with tea and set it down with her usual quiet grace. He won't let me near the cut on his face, Elena said, her eyes carrying the knowing patience of a woman who had managed Adriano for years. He is in the library, she added before leaving. Claire went downstairs and found him there, sleeves rolled up, staring at legal documents with his phone face down. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of an old clock. Claire walked the corridors she had spent 6 weeks learning and retrieved the first aid kit. She sat across from him in the library and opened the kit without asking. When he said she did not need to do this, she ignored him gently and prepared the antiseptic. Hold still, she whispered, and he obeyed. She cleaned the wound with careful hands, feeling his steady gaze on her. When she asked about the warrant, he said his attorney believed it was manageable, though the coming months would require painful restructuring. This will change your business, she said, and my life. As she applied the final closure strips, he admitted he had wanted change for a long time. She smoothed the adhesive and stepped back. Neither of them pretended the word change made anything easy. The building was part of that, she asked. He looked at her and admitted he was 39 years old and had spent 8 years running an empire he had never chosen, simply because he was competent and knew nothing else. He spoke of his grandfather's letter, which said the townhouse was the only family asset not bought with money that had cost someone else their soul. He wanted me to build something, Adriano said, not just maintain a dynasty. Claire listened to the old stone breathing around them. You can't just walk away, she said. No, he agreed. Not immediately. He sounded tired, but not defeated. For the first time, she heard a future in his voice instead of only strategy. It can be restructured, Adriano said, admitting the path toward legitimacy would be long but real. Claire let the words settle and faced them with the honesty that had carried her through the past months. She would not soften the truth. She thought of her marriage, 3 years with a man who hid what he was, and compared him with Adriano, who had been frighteningly honest once cornered by the facts. The choices that mattered were not clean. They were made with eyes open, looking at him. She changed the subject to the servant staircase. She wanted to restore the 4th floor landing next. Its ironwork had been hidden under boards since the 90s, waiting to be seen again. She began packing the first aid kit. I want to reach that part of the restoration before the contractor finishes the south wing, Claire said, then paused and looked up. I need to know you are committed to the whole building, not just the easy parts. Adriano met her eyes. The whole building. I have said so from the beginning. She felt his gaze on her, steady and strangely comforting. The gift of being seen fully by someone who refused to look away. I meant what I said in the hall, she whispered. He leaned closer. Claire, I have loved you since the servant staircase 6 weeks ago. The warrant. The investigation. None of it changes that. This time. She did not look away. The federal investigation. Damonvale. None of it changes this, Adriano said, his voice dropping. You are not a situation I am managing. You are not someone I protect out of convenience. You are, he stopped, and his face softened into something real. Stripped of defense. You are the person I want to build something with, instead of only maintaining things. Claire looked at him as the library seemed to breathe around them. Okay, she said. It was a small word, but it carried everything she was ready to risk. He reached across the desk and took her hand with unwavering resolve. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that 2 damaged people had just chosen a difficult, honest beginning. The shadows did not lift quickly. Claire watched the federal investigation grind on for 4 months, cold and institutional. Adriano's attorneys worked through dim nights, restructuring businesses and steering him away from charges. They called it a managed outcome. He called it expensive. Damon's fall came faster. Within 6 weeks. Electronic evidence forced him to surrender both property and freedom. His sentence was short, the familiar mercy of privilege. But the record of his guilt mattered more than the length of his exile. He could no longer play the wounded husband without the facts answering back, and when he tried, the city no longer listened. A biting Tuesday wind swept across the stone steps of the lower Manhattan courthouse. The whole ordeal took exactly 14 minutes, reducing years of shared life to a single sheet of paper. Claire held the document with both hands, her fingers stiff in the February cold, but her eyes stayed dry. She had spent her tears long ago. Not for Damon, but for the younger woman who had once believed him. Marta stood beside her like a quiet guard and held the papers while Claire pulled on her gloves. Later, in a nearby cafe, Marta asked over steaming mugs if she was going back to the building. Claire nodded. Eyes on the street. Adriano was waiting. And the thought no longer frightened her the way it once had. He is also a man whose darkness I understand, Claire said, her voice steady. I have always known who he is. This is not a surprise I am trying to manage. It is a truth I have looked at directly. She was no longer living on hope alone. She was a woman who demanded reality. The Marcus Calloway project had survived because she refused to let it fail. By January, she stood in the restored East Wing reception rooms, where original plaster and wood glowed beneath her hands. Calloway walked the space in complete silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried rare, genuine reverence. It was the finest restoration he had seen in 15 years. Claire believed him because he was looking at the work, not the scandal. Standing on the frozen pavement, Claire pressed the phone to her ear as the cold bit at her cheeks. Adriano listened in a heavy silence, not indifferent, but feeling too much to answer at once. I knew it would be, he finally murmured. I didn't need to see it. A tight knot in Claire's chest loosened slightly. Healing was slow. Deliberate reconstruction, much like the townhouse they were bringing back to life. By spring, the building was transformed but still unfinished, proof of her belief that real art could not be rushed. Adriano understood that. He respected the slow rhythm of stone. He had also begun learning to respect the slow rhythm of change, which proved harder. The townhouse began to breathe again, room by room. In the grand entrance hall, the cracked marble was not replaced. It was stabilized and polished, leaving the fine lines of old damage visible and honest. When the crystal chandeliers were finally lit, warm light moved across the space, and Elena stood beneath them with a trembling expression, as if the reversal of loss was almost too much to bear. But the servant staircase remained closest to Claire's heart. Working with a specialist, she stripped away decades of paint and revealed the delicate ironwork beneath. It was not perfect. That was why she loved it. The marks remained, but they no longer looked like neglect. As evening light passed through the landing window and cast long shadows across the restored ironwork, Adriano found Claire sitting on the top step. He sat beside her, and the great house settled into peaceful silence around them. For a long while, neither spoke. They simply let the warmth of the afternoon linger. "Do you remember your grandfather's letter?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wanted someone to make something, not just maintain things. Adriano stayed still, his hand finding hers on the cold step. "I think he would love what we are making," he said. Claire looked down the narrow staircase and imagined all the hidden places finally given light. They married in October, almost exactly 1 year after that morning in the cafe, high on the restored rooftop terrace, with Manhattan spread below them. 20 of their closest friends gathered in the autumn sun. Claire stood tall in a dark, clean-lined dress and spoke her vows with the clear voice of a woman who finally knew her worth. Adriano answered with the steady gravity of a man who did not offer promises lightly and meant every one he made. Marta cried and blamed the wind. Elena pretended not to notice while handing her a handkerchief. Above the rushing city, the tragedies of their past did not vanish, but they loosened enough to let joy in. Later, Claire and Adriano stood on the rooftop with drinks in hand while the city stretched beneath them like a painting. Adriano looked at the glittering skyline with that familiar expression of deep, unreadable thought. He spoke of the building, of what it had been when Claire first arrived and what they had made of it together. Claire reminded him that rebuilding always takes two. Their eyes met, steady and certain. Below them, Manhattan pulsed on, indifferent to their quiet victory, full of strangers in cafes and corner booths. Somewhere down there, women were still sitting across from men they feared, counting exits and pretending not to shake. Claire hoped they would find a door, a witness, a voice, anything that helped them leave. She had come to sign divorce papers and left with a business card and a life she never could have imagined. She had set out to restore a building and, in the process, rebuild herself. That was the secret of restoration. You begin with the visible cracks, only to discover that the foundation underneath matters most. Looking out over the city, Claire felt a calm courage. It was not naive hope. It was strength earned the hard way. She was no longer afraid in the same way. She knew life did not suddenly become safe because a cruel man was gone, or a good man loved her. Safety was something built, checked, repaired, and chosen again. She knew Adriano carried a world she would spend years trying to understand. The path would not be easy, but it would be honest. They stood together like survivors, no longer untouched by fear, but no longer ruled by it. Peace did not feel like a fairy tale ending. It felt like a quiet room, a locked door that did not frighten her, and a hand she could hold without shrinking. Her hand rested on the cold October iron railing as she looked down at the indifferent city, and gratitude rose in her sudden and pure. "Let's go inside," she said softly. "It's cold." "In a minute," Adriano replied, his eyes moving across the Manhattan skyline. She waited beside him. Neither of them looked back down at the streets or at the shadows they had left behind. They stood together on the terrace, side by side, while the cold wind moved around them, in that fragile quiet. They chose to look forward into the uncertain future they were building together. Healing did not mean the ruins disappeared. It meant they no longer had to live inside them, beneath the endless New York sky. They let the silence speak for them, knowing that the longest roads often begin with one simple decision: to stop looking back long enough to take the next step.